Hi, I'm James Jackson and welcome to another episode of Mad in Germany. For this episode, I spoke with Daniel Marwecki, the leading expert on the history of the German-Israeli relationship, about his book, Whitewashing and State Building, which gives you a hint of what this relationship is really about. We talked about the historical antisemitism of West German elites and why that led to them supporting Israel, as well as how strange it is to have your own country's Staatsräson being related to that of a foreign state, and what this says about German replacement nationalism. So I thought it was a really interesting conversation. I hope you do too. Stay tuned and stay mad. Welcome to another episode of Mad in Germany, the podcast looking at German psychodrama in the world. I'm here with renowned historian Daniel Marwecki, who has written an amazing book, Germany and Israel, Whitewashing and Statecraft, that came out 4 years ago, but is more current and more relevant than ever before. So, Daniel, your book was also recently translated into German, wasn't it? What was the reaction on that like?
It was good. First, let me correct you, James. I don't think I'm very renowned, or even my proper historian friends wouldn't really call me a historian, but somebody does political science historically, which I think is very, very important thing to do. But thank you, nevertheless, for the introduction. So the reaction to the German book was much better than I expected. It came, so to say, at a very bad moment after October 7th, after the war started. But because of that moment in the Middle East conflict, it got, I think, a certain attention that it wouldn't have otherwise gotten. So this attention was very positive because this book is not about the German psychodrama, as we call it. It's a very, I hope, calm, empirical, historical study of the actual drivers of German Israel policy and the actual German role in the conflict, which in Germany we totally ignore, at least publicly, which is very strange. So I try to give the, real picture, so to say, of German-Israeli relations, which is quite different from the picture you get if you just follow German news media or German parliamentary debates. So very positive reception. I received a big praise in the FAZ, which was very surprising and fantastic. Did an interview with each side, things like that. So, I wouldn't have expected.
But so,
to be honest.
when you say the real history, you mean you're kind of sticking to the facts and the material facts in looking at how Germany specifically supported Israel in the early years?
Exactly. Well, I went into the archives, which is what others did not do. And there's a lot to be found there. So what I focused on in the book is the, as you say, early history of German-Israeli relations, West German-Israeli relations, right? Which are a lot more important than we commonly assume. I think the general idea in Germany is that we, the German nation, have turned towards Israel for more reasons, but other than that, we haven't played a large role in the Middle East. And in fact, the opposite is much more likely to be true. The turn towards Israel was done out of a desire for, whitewashing, as I call it, rehabilitation, as Adenauer called it on German television. Right? And in return, what did Israel get? I mean, why would Israel, the Jewish state, the state of survivors, turn to West Germany of all countries, right? This would be the last country you want to have relations with. And the reason is a very simple material one. It's state building. So West Germany gave to Israel everything it needed to build the state. Industrial aid via the reparations agreement, military aid, which was substantial and really important also for winning the Six-Day War in 1967, as well as financial aid. So Germany was the only country, West Germany, to give to Israel all these three forms of support in the early formative phase of Israeli state building. Because after 1967, Israel is quite stable in the region. Right before 1967, that was not the case. It was Germany that helped stabilize Israel, which is a massive irony of history, of course, but one that we don't really talk about much, I think, in Germany. We talk about ourselves, we talk about other things.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people associate Israel with the US foreign policy and also, the British Mandate and the Balfour Declaration, and they don't really see Germany as an actor in this sense, except for committing the Holocaust and causing what they would call a need for Israel.
exactly the moral justification for the creation, the birth of Israel. But as an actual player in the conflict, Germany is ignored, right, in the debate. And this is something I try to rectify. The US only really turned towards Israel and started to support it decisively after 67. Why? Because in the 1967 war, Israel really beat Arab nationalism as embodied by Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. So Israel really showed itself as a very capable military ally in the region. Right? And well, why has it become this important or this, capable military ally? Also because of German help. Not exclusively, of course, but Germany was quite important in that regard. And that is a part of the history I tried to show in the book. I mean, it goes up until the present day, right? But I think the bulk of the book is about the first decades, which are so important.
And in those first decades, Israel was supported by various Western powers, the UK, France, but your research found that it was Germany who materially contributed more than anyone else.
I think it's really if you count all these three forms of support together, right? So the reparations agreement was crucial because it helped industrialize the Israeli economy. Israel was an agrarian state, it didn't have a modern economy, and German industrial help really helped building factories. It put machines into those factories, trains, ships, everything you need to build, a modern economy. Then on top of that, you have to add military relations, German military supplies, also German military, the Germans bought military goods from Israel, so they helped building up the Israeli military industry. Right? And then there was this case of a secret financial loan, about which there's still speculation whether it helped finance the Israeli nuclear program. So it's really those three things put together that make up this important German role that has been so far quite understudied.
And so that's the state building part of your argument, but what about the whitewashing part?
Yes. May I quote Konrad Adenauer?
Please.
So here's Konrad Adenauer, the former German chancellor now, in 1965 on German television, interviewed by Günther Gauss, a famous German journalist. And this is 2 years after his chancellorship. And this quote is now quite well known, but it's really, it just, really summarizes the German approach and the whitewashing argument. So here's Konrad Adenauer on German television saying the following, I quote, "We had done to the Jews so much injustice, committed such crimes against them, that somehow these had to be expiated or repaired if we were at all to regain our international standing." So there it is, it's about international standing.
It was conditional, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Furthermore, the power of the Jews, even today, especially in America, should not be underestimated. End of quotation. So there you have it. It's rehabilitation. No, it's about German international standing. And it's about anti-Semitism. There's this idea of Jewish power that is clearly anti-Semitic.
That's shocking, isn't it?
It's crazy. And this kind of thing you find throughout in the archives, also when it comes to internal discussions within the cabinet, for example.
So you mean that this idea among the West German elite was actually we need to sort of placate the Jews by giving them support for Israel because they're so influential in the US? That wasn't just an off-the-cuff remark by Adenauer. That was
there is some of that. It's not the main reason. I think it's an additional reason. I think the main reason is the German need for rehabilitation and reintegration into the Western Bloc. So West Germany really is a child of the Cold War. Without the Cold War, this federal republic would not have been, there wouldn't have been a need really for West Germany. Mm-hmm. But what West Germany needed, it had, it quickly had an army, it had the capital, it had all that, but it needed its reputation back, so to say, right? And paying reparations, entering this relationship with Israel helped in, rehabilitating the German state. So I think this is really at the core of the relationship from the German side. Mm-hmm. And through this, you have to add the Cold War in another sense. Israel was seen as a Western country in the Middle East, and as such had to be supported, right? And Germany was just the most important supporter, but this was an overall Western strategy, of course. I mean, when we just talked about the turning point of 1967.
But before then, Germany was instrumental in helping Israel establish itself and gain kind of a bulwark in the Middle East as a Western project and as a Zionist project.
That's how Adenauer put it to Ben-Gurion in the 1960s meeting. We will support you, also because of this, because you're, what did he say? You're a Western ally in the Cold War in that region. So yeah, there's geopolitics and whitewashing. I think these things. For Germany, the arguments against rearmament could be answered by saying, look, we are supporting Israel with these weapons. So that's actually a fantastic argument against the critics of German rearmament.
Right. So it's actually been, this whitewashing has taken place across many different industries.
I think so, but it's really where state power is expressed in the most clear sense, which is violence, right? So it's not a coincidence that this reconciliation takes place in the military sphere, first of all.
Wow. So Israel kind of providing an excuse for Germany to remilitarize, or at least set up the arms industry.
I wouldn't go that far, but that's part of the story. It's all part of the story of German integration into the Western Bloc.
So-called Westbindung. And how did it look with the East at this time? Because Germany was in competition. There were two Germanys, East and West, capitalist and communist, and the Eastern Germany famously supported the Palestinians. They even had German stamps with Palestinian keffiyehs and flags on them. So was it about marking themselves as different from East Germany? How serious was this East German solidarity with Palestine?
I'm not sure if you know that, but the first state, state is the right word, the first actor to recognize Israel was the Soviet Union, right? So this wasn't clear, from the start that Israel would be part of this East-West issue to that extent. It became part of the story throughout the years when sort of like Arab nationalism solidified against Israel, and Israel needed help also, against Arab nationalism. So East Germany and West Germany really defined themselves also on the Palestine issue, as did the West German left against the West German government, right? And the West German left was, of course, sort of like in touch with the East German state as well. There's this magazine called Konkret, which you might know today. It used to be funded by East Germany, right? West Germany.
By the Stasi, or
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it did form part of the East-West struggle. Of course, West Germany was a lot more important to Israel than East Germany was to the Arab states. And East Germany really, followed the Soviet Union in that regard. The Soviet Union's drive towards anti-Zionism and also antisemitism in parts, whereas West Germany was part of the Western camp and followed the Western Israel policy.
So you mentioned the West German left. I mean, you're talking about the Baader-Meinhof gang, the Rote Armee Fraktion, who of course trained with Palestinian militants, correct? So what we've seen was the 1968 movement and before, and the radical left opposing Germany's pro-Israel politics. But was that a big part of their disagreement with Germany, with West Germany, from the left?
I think the West German left, one issue they had with West Germany is that they saw, they saw the forces at work that were pushing with this pro-Israel policy, right? And these were people such as Adenauer, such as Strauss, especially people who stood for revisionism within German society. So Israel got identified with these forces in West German society, and that's part of and it's not all of it, but it's part of the West German aversion. The West German left's, turn towards an anti-Israel position. It had been quite pro-Israel before.
Okay, so how much did the West German left define itself against the federal government's Israel policies?
So I think there's two issues at work. One issue is anti-Semitism that did exist without question on the West German left. Another issue, however, also is the fact that it was revisionist forces in the German government pushing what is very pro-Israel policy. So from the West German left's perspective, it was the wrong people in Germany that pushed for this.
When you say revisionist forces, what do you mean?
Strauss, Adenauer, so people who stood for German power.
Conservatives.
Who stood for German power without a real working through of the past, right? Basically, a government that had integrated former Nazis, former servants of the regime.
You mean Hans Globke?
Hans Globke, for example, a very prominent example, but actually throughout the German sort of like functional elite, people were reintegrated that had served the regime before that, right? So for the West German left, seeing those forces at work now playing this role in the Middle East, that was strange, right? I think so it's a complicated issue.
Definitely.
I think there is this issue of post-war anti-Semitism at work as well. I think it's very, very clear. The West German left had been more anti-Zionist than any other kind of left. And there were some, I think, psychic reasons for that as well. But I think it has to also be seen in the context of West Germany's Israel policy, which was pushed by people like Strauss, Globke, and so on, right? People they identified against.
So for people who don't know, Globke was Adenauer's right-hand man. Right. He was his chief of staff, and he was also a jurist, legal expert who was key in writing an interpretation of how Nazi Germany would interpret the Nuremberg laws. So very much a paid-up collaborator with the Nazis, who then became Adenauer's chief of staff, and in fact also played a role in the relationship with Israel, right? Because there was this informal agreement, as I understand it, that West Germany would not complain about Eichmann during the Eichmann trial, because Eichmann was captured by Mossad, and West Germany would let that happen on agreement with that they wouldn't go, that Israel and Mossad wouldn't go after Globke. Have you heard that before?
So the Eichmann trial in the very early 1960s was very important in the relationship and also quite symbolic for the relationship. What happened? Eichmann was caught by the Mossad in Argentina, brought to trial in Jerusalem, and the German government was truly worried about the possible implications for the West German standing in the world. All right, they were worried that Eichmann would implicate his former comrades,
Comrades, yeah.
In the West German government, right?
Including Globke and others.
Exactly. So what happened was that Adenauer made it very clear to Ben-Gurion that there would be no financial aid and no weapons unless this trial is exclusively about the previous Germany, and the new Germany, which wasn't that new, would be let off the hook. So that was the implicit deal behind the whole trial, right?
Wow.
So weirdly, the Eichmann trial became an important stepping stone in the reconciliation, if you want to call it that. It's a really bad word, but it's the worst.
Versöhnung, right?
Yeah, it's a strange Versöhnungsgeschichte.
Yeah.
Between Germany and Israel, right? Because it really demarcated the old Germany from the new one, which is it's to some extent an artificial, of course, demarcation. I mean, we're talking the early 1960s, right? That's shortly after the Holocaust and World War II.
But if you actually go back, Germany didn't initially want Eichmann to go on trial, right? So Fritz Bauer, this famous prosecutor who was a prosecutor in the Auschwitz trials, he was trying to catch Eichmann, but he was being undermined by old Nazis in the West German security service.
He knew where Eichmann was, but he was afraid to tell that to, his colleagues in Germany, right? He was afraid they would warn him, and then that he wouldn't be caught. And he had good reasons to be afraid. For Germany, absolutely did not want Adolf Eichmann to go on trial. But then when he did go on trial, it made sure that this trial would only be about the old Germany that was in the past.
So they pursued a kind of damage limitation strategy there.
Definitely, which worked out quite well. So the Germans were really quite happy with the outcome of the trial. In the archives, I found the internal report by the observer delegation, to the tribe, and they reported back in a very content way to the Adenauer government that Ben Gurion had not implicated, other people in the government, and that Israel overall made a very positive impression to the Germans. And I think what we have to remember all that time for Israel, and especially for the Israeli public, they didn't want this relationship with Germany, especially, your average Israeli citizen did not want to have anything to do with Germany.
They hated Germany.
Of course they did. Why wouldn't they?
Yeah.
This idea of a miracle of reconciliation is absolute bollocks. It has to be, because there's no reason whatsoever for any Israeli to reconcile with the murderers of their families. And the only reason was, again, the aid, the weapons, and so on that Germany gave to Israel at this crucial time in Israeli state building.
But there was actually a lot of reaction to this deal when it came out, right? The Luxembourg deal in Israel. It almost toppled Ben Gurion's government.
Exactly. There were two big crisis points in the early Israeli state, or two big questions. The first question was the Palestinian question: what to do with the refugees, what to do with the conflict. The second question was the German question, right? There was even a very, very small attempt to combine these two questions, in the sense of using some of Germany's reparations money to repair damage done to the Palestinian refugees, right? But this
Wow.
meant linking those two questions together. That didn't happen, of course, because each question for itself was already explosive enough, right? But this shows you also how important Ben Gurion thought the agreement with Germany would be. He was willing to risk his government over the reparations question. So he knew how crucial reparations were to Israeli state building. And of course, the formation of Israel was seen as the only adequate response to the Holocaust. Right? It's just a major irony of history, again, that West Germany would be so important, to the creation, to the stabilization.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So
it's a very strange story, but I think it's important to remember that this wasn't a thing about Israel wanting to forgive Germany, not at all. So from the Israeli side, it's a very clear deal. It's something you do out of necessity. And it's the German side that invents this whole story of a miracle of reconciliation. All that is an exclusively German kind of talk that you wouldn't hear in Israel or anywhere else, really.
But do you think this idea worked in the eyes of the international community, that Germany was forgiven a bit more easily? Or do you think that came through Aufarbeitung and through this kind of memory culture a bit later? Because I can remember, I'm 35, so I can remember there's been, in my lifetime, as I perceive it, a shift in how Germany is viewed in the world, and that's kind of come along a bit more with this idea of memory politics, which is often quite memorialized. It's about building the Holocaust Memorial, it's about the Stolpersteine, it's these kind of memorials, some of which Deborah Feldman told me were very much heartfelt and from the German grassroots rather than a state project. But I think it is a bit of both as well.
It is a bit of both, and I think everything that you are saying does a lot more to improve the German reputation than anything else, because it's actually very serious. There is a serious engagement with the past in Germany, and this is something that shouldn't be forgotten just when we look at the sort of like strangeness of current German discourse, right? There is a serious attempt, or there are serious attempts to deal with something that cannot be dealt with. By historical logic, the German state shouldn't have continued to exist after the Holocaust, after World War II, right?
Interesting.
Historical morality, maybe. It's historical logic.
Controversial, but...
No, but really, I think the experiment of German nationhood really sort of like came to a close with that.
It could have, right? Because Germany was not actually existing for that long before this as a nation.
Exactly. So you could, of course, argue that German nationalism, German nation had gone badly wrong, and that it should have stopped existing. Right? That was, of course, the idea of, behind the Morgenthau Plan, for example.
Of course.
But again, the Cold War, Germany was rebuilt, and because the rebuilding, the reintegration of Germany was decided upon, I think this rehabilitation factor shouldn't be overrated too much. It was the last, how do you say, Pinselstrich. What's a good word for that? The last little brush.
The brushstroke.
Brushstroke.
Yeah.
To aid German reintegration into the West.
So coming back to what you said a minute ago about the Palestinian question and the German question being related, I want to kind of invert that, because one thing that I don't think has been ever really dealt with in German society, the creation of Israel is seen as such a unalloyed, pure positive in German discourse. Some people have even called it, perhaps provocatively, Germany's happy ending to the Holocaust, right? But this happy ending so-called happy ending for Israelis actually did create a large refugee crisis for Palestinians in the Nakba in 1948. So do you think Germany needs to reckon with its own history of involvement in that as well? Is the Palestinian conflict also a German problem because of the Holocaust, which led to the creation of Israel, or the need for it?
The Holocaust led to the creation of Israel because Zionism is older than the Holocaust, right? But it was a big sort of like ex post facto argument for the creation of Israel. I can tell you how the German government at the time dealt with that question, because of course that was the Arab argument. That was the argument of the Arab League, for example, right?
Interesting.
That complained to West Germany about reparations precisely because it ignored the reparations issue ignored the Palestinian issue, right? So I quote from the Arab League's letters to the German government, for example, which say that Germany, may be allowed to pay reparations, but not to a state that was created on Arab soil, right? And this argument you hear until today, that Germany is basically whitewashing its past on the back of Palestinians, right? So this argument is very old. It's really rooted in the beginning of the conflict and in the beginning of German-Israel policy. So what did West Germany do? What did Adenauer do? He saw the problem and he denied any responsibility. So what he said was, look, what we pay to Israel, we do out of the reasons that relate to our own past, to our European, to our German history, but it has nothing to do with the conflict, right? So this really sort of like, apolitical humanitarian memory base, but it has nothing to do with you.
Even though we're giving you weapons. Or we're giving Israel weapons.
It was harder to argue. So he was arguing about the reparations agreement itself at first, right? So there was an attempt to sort of like de-link the two, whereas Arab states and then later the Palestinians try to link them together. And the Palestinian issue itself was seen until the emergence of the PLO as a purely humanitarian problem that could be dealt by, giving humanitarian aid, payments to UNRWA, for example.
Right.
So for Germany, it made sense politically to de-link the two. And for Palestinians, it always made sense to link the two. And this debate you can observe until the present day. Probably today more so even than used to be the case.
Exactly, because one of the chants of the protest movement since October 7th has been free Palestine from German guilt, which is a statement which is taken by many on the right to be, or many on the pro-Israel side of German politics, to be almost a far-right thing, because they associate it with the rejection of guilt. But actually, you could argue that what the protesters are saying is we need to link these two questions, Germany's role in all of this stuff and Germany to stop supporting Israel, who are punishing the Palestinians.
That's true, but then I still think that the protesters are getting the history wrong, because for Germany this wasn't about guilt at all. It was about whitewashing guilt, right? So for Adenauer, for Strauss especially, turning towards Israel was a way more of forgetting about the past than remembering it. Right? So it was a very limited form of contrition. But at the same time, German governments reintegrated former regime loyal.
Nazi regime.
Yeah, exactly. There was no social culture of working through the past. There were anti-Semitism scandals, all of that. So this was really about guilt in the beginning, right? It's about whitewashing. So this is why I think the argument goes wrong a little bit, even though I understand the sentiment and the political agenda behind linking those issues. Because of course Germany right now, when it gives Israel weapons in the name of its Staatsräson, these weapons are being used against, Gazans, right? So the link is there.
Yeah. But it wasn't actually guilt. It was more just a whitewashing project from the beginning.
Exactly. So this is something, and there I think, I would caution against using that kind of slogan. But
It's certainly controversial.
I can see how it makes for a good slogan. I just don't think that it gets the history right.
Right, because there was no guilt in the early days. So was it
truer today than it used to be? I'm not sure.
I think, quite possibly. But are you effectively calling early German support for Israel a Schlussstrich, this line through the past, so that we could get over the Nazis, show we're not Nazis anymore?
When you want to rehabilitate yourself, the idea is that you go through a process of rehabilitation, and then at some point it's finished, right? You're good. You are normal. And starting with 1965, when the two countries established diplomatic relations, West Germany and Israel, the West German idea is to normalize, and that's direct quote, relations with Israel. So Ludwig Erhard, the chancellor, says, we leave the past behind us. And the first German ambassador to Israel was a Wehrmacht officer on the Eastern Front.
Wow.
He said, we're going to normalize relations with Israel now. Everything is normal. The past does not play a role. We will not give any outsized support. That's it. Now relations are normal, right?
Wow.
And that's the logical endpoint of Adenauer's stated policy of rehabilitation, right? This attempt to normalize relations. And that is really fascinating to trace the correspondence between this guy, Rolf Pauls, who lost an arm on the Eastern Front, received an Iron Cross for his services, right? This guy, the way he talks about Israel, about his Israeli interlocutors with his German superior. So what he basically says is, look, we have to normalize, but then again, he talks about, Jewish power and all that stuff. So he goes into all these anti-Semitic tirades about, Jewish influence in the world, and that, well, after all, we can't normalize because, they are still so powerful. Right?
Wow.
So you have this crazy anti-Semitism there as well, right?
From the ambassador to Israel.
The first German ambassador to Israel.
Wow.
So he was an outright anti-Semite, right? So with this, so maybe some of what you call the German psychodrama makes sense because it's based on this very strange, unacknowledged history, basically, right? This really strange exchange between whitewashing and state building that is greased with, quite a heavy dose of German post-war anti-Semitism as well.
And how does the Staatsräson fit into this? So this comes a lot later, but obviously building on both this whitewashing project as well as memory culture, which developed later than many people assume in the 80s, 90s, 2000s.
Yeah.
So what do you think of the Staatsräson? I mean, it's not really in the German law, this idea that Germany is responsible for Israel's security, but it has, according to you, always been there in a sense, but with less of a moralistic tone.
Yeah, there's different ways of answering this question. I think first of all, people who are interested in Staatsräson should read Angela Merkel's speech that she gave in 2008 to the Israeli parliament, where she first called the security of Israel as a part of Germany's reason of state. And the term was used earlier by a German ambassador to Israel, and even used by Joshua Fischer before that.
The foreign minister under the Greens.
Sorry, the former foreign minister. So what did Angela Merkel mean? In her speech, she talked mostly about Iran and the Iranian potential nuclear threat to Israel. And the material expression of Staatsräson in that sense are the submarines that Germany has been supplying Israel with that can be armed with nuclear weapons, right? So they form a second strike capability against Iran. So they are a hugely important part of Israel's naval strategy, right? So that's a very clear, direct expression of Staatsräson. So the term has actual meaning in this bilateral relationship, right? Another way to think about Staatsräson is to think about the term itself and what it means. So I'm not sure what Merkel intended, but in political science, we understand Staatsräson as, you know, everything that a state does to reproduce itself, to keep itself in power, right? So this could mean winning a war, fighting down an internal opposition, the ugly side of power, basically, right?
Wow.
So it's very strange that you would use this term to describe what is supposed to be a moral relationship, right? So every state in this world has a Staatsräson because every state would, you know, do bad things to keep itself in power. I think Germany is the only state that made the Staatsräson of another state its own Staatsräson.
Yes.
Right? At least in official discourse. Not even the US does that, even though, of course, the US is much more important to Israel than Germany is, right? Because it's the US. And I think this explains the identity debates that you have in Germany and the ways in which German nationalism uses Israel to create its own nationalism, right? I think for a specific type of German liberal nationalism, the relationship with Israel is absolutely integral. And in the book, I trace a couple of recent Bundestag debates where this comes through very much. So I quote Friedrich Merz, for example, or leading politicians of the Green Party, who all say that, in a sense, that Israel's right to exist is the German right to exist, right? So the two states are linked, I think, in this official kind of German mentality. So German nationalism today relies quite a bit on this relationship, as it is imagined by Germany.
And I think this is something really interesting about the German discourse. It's kind of cross-party on all of this stuff. You mentioned Greens and Merz. On most issues, they could not be more opposed. But when it comes to Israel, they're completely aligned. And I think actually one thing I've heard is that it's the left wing of the Greens sometimes who are more like the Green Youth in particular, that are more pro-Israel because of this so-called anti-Deutsch, I call it ultra-Deutsch movement and their influence. But what the ultra-Deutsch have really done historically is just bring the German left and radical left in alignment with the German mainstream politics, which is very pro-Israel.
Yeah, I think the word ultra-Deutsch, which I hear for the first time, but I think it makes sense. Because, well, if being anti-Deutsch means identifying with Israel and the security of Israel, well, this is what the German state does.
And it has always done.
It has done from the beginning. So that's just a way of really identifying with Germany. Even though I think the anti-Deutsch movement, when it was first created after so-called unification, reunification, it definitely had a point in being, you know, very critical and afraid of German nationalism. Right, so I think
Nie wieder Deutschland.
Yeah, so I think the original anti-Deutsch, they certainly did have a point, but yeah, they have. I think you explained it all very well on Twitter.
Yeah, I mean, I think they dropped the opposition to Germany, and I actually wrote an article, I think in November, about how the anti-Deutsch have taken over the German or been very influential in the German discourse, but in the process kind of abolished themselves because they've dropped opposition to Germany. You know, people, I've seen leading figures of their movement say stuff like, well, you know, maybe Germany's not that bad because we really support Israel a lot. So
one of the few countries in the world that do so, and to this extent.
Yeah,
that's number 2 after the US.
In terms of weapons deliveries.
Yeah, and I think also political commitment. I mean, of course, Austria or Hungary,
Czech Republic,
they make more pro-Israel statements or votes at the United Nations, for example.
Yeah,
they are, you know, as countries, they are less influential.
True,
so
they're smaller.
Influential countries, Germany really plays, you know, a hugely important role for Israel.
We saw that recently in the International Court of Justice, where and the International Criminal Court, where Germany has been writing these amicus briefs, which have been arguing against the arrest warrant for Netanyahu, basically. So how does Germany kind of, because, support for Israel is one part of post-war West German reason of state, but another thing that's always been important for West Germany was respecting international law. All of these post-war institutions came about after the Second World War, and Germany was always, supposedly always in favor of these international institutions, the International Criminal Court. But now they're arguing against its jurisdiction in Israel. Germany has been quite quiet about the ruling that found that Israel is practicing apartheid in the occupied territories. So how do they square this circle?
Germany has not opposed international law of justice, for example, to the extent that the US has done when it came to these arrest warrants. So I think that was definitely a significant step as well. As it also could have gone into another direction.
True.
Basically, at this point in time, Staatsräson and international law seem to be mutually exclusive. And it's just a dilemma that can't be bridged. I think for Germany, the commitment to Israel has always been about an Israel that existed in the German mind. It's always been a construction. Right?
Imagination.
An idealized version. Right? And in that sense, it shares a few aspects with antisemitism, which also relies on, imaginations that have more to do with the one who is doing the projecting than the objects of the projection. Right? So there's that.
What do you mean by that? What is the German idealized Israel, and how does it differ from real Israel? Really existing.
Israel is a complex country. It has a left, it has a right, it has ultra-religious nationalists, it has anti-nationalist religious forces. It's a complex society.
And 20% of them are Arab, Palestinians, Israelis.
Exactly. So for Germany, it is important, I think, to rely on an idealized version of the Israeli state against which Germany can also be measured in a positive kind of way, right? So when you have a situation like now in Gaza, where you have, war crimes, for example, this reflects very badly on the Staatsräson, right? If Staatsräson means that we are working through our past, then war crimes don't look good in that regard, right? So of course you have a dilemma there that can't really be bridged. I do think that, for example, the South African case against Israel has shocked, I think, the German government to some extent, and then Nicaragua's attempt to put Germany on trial for complicity in genocide, as they call it. I think this has ruffled a few feathers in Germany and has shaken a few people in government a bit. So, for example, weapon deliveries went down also in this year, right? And the tone has become more critical also on behalf of the Foreign Office. But of course, Germany is still generally supportive, of course.
Yeah. And do you think that there is going to be any shift? I mean, I was maybe expecting more of one when the ICJ ruled that Israel was practicing apartheid, So I had a conversation with a colleague of mine, and I said, well, what about the apartheid ruling? And they said, well, just because the ICJ says it doesn't mean it's apartheid. And, in my mind, I think if you choose to respect international law, then it is by definition, because apartheid is a legal ruling, right? But it hasn't really changed much of the discourse. And in fact, even after this ruling, the RIAs, which is these people who measure antisemitism, they described an Israeli apartheid pride flag. It said no pride in apartheid or something like that. And they said, well, that's anti-Semitic.
Yeah. But I think there you have to differentiate between German domestic discourse, or whatever you want to call it, and German foreign policy. And I think there's also a big divide between what German officials would say in public and what they would say in private, right? And give you an example for the book, I did some field work in Israel, in the West Bank, and in Jerusalem, and I interviewed a lot of German officials, aid workers, representatives, and so forth. And they asked me, look, do you want to have the official version, which is going to be boring, but you can record that version? Or do you want my version, which is a lot more interesting, you can't record it? So I always opted for the, non-official account, which was a lot more nuanced, a lot more complex, a lot more critical than the official narrative, right? And there's a big irony there, because I think German officials, German government agencies, they know a lot about what's going on in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, before the war and so on. But domestically, it's just a different logic, different debate logic. So that's why you have this divide, I think, between official debates, official pronouncements, and, the discussions that are going on also with Israeli counterparts in the foreign ministry and so on.
So one thing that strikes me a lot about this domestic debate, I mean, a lot of the time the people who are cancelled are themselves Jews, and sometimes, quite often Israelis. So there was a study by internal research by the Diaspora Alliance that found that 25% of people approximately who have been cancelled for protesting have actually been themselves Jewish, which is, of course, massively disproportionate to how many Jews there are in Germany. There's not that many, and the majority are post-Soviet Russian Jews, or post-Soviet, I should say. So, of course, many Jewish people feel very involved in this conflict, and a lot of the time I feel like the German government has said, of course we stop anti-Semitism because we support Israel, but no, we're not going to allow people to have, Jewish people who feel strongly about this issue, to have this freedom of speech. Do you think this is going to change, or is it more about German feelings than it is about foreign policy and domestic policy?
It's a domestic logic for sure. I think it's also a Berlin logic, because in other German länder or cities, I think it depends on who's governing and so on. But I think the sentiment is generally more liberal. So, for example, I was now in the city of Hanover. I gave a little talk on my book, right? And they have regular pro-Palestine demonstrations and nobody cares,
Right.
In Berlin, it's a different story. There's police violence and so on. So I'm not quite sure what it is, but it's a very strange statistic. And I think it shows a, fairly obvious liberalism at work. That is, however, I don't quite understand it, to be honest. I mean, Netanyahu, in his long time as Israeli prime minister, has identified two major threats, which is Iran and then the BDS movement, right? And Germany has helped in a way against both. So it has helped against Iran, and it does really help against the BDS movement and the whole pro-Palestine movement in general through its domestic politics. But I'm not sure this is out of solidarity with Israel. I think it's a very German phenomenon.
Kind of about...
Which I'm still struggling to understand. So I'm not sure if I can give you a very good answer at this stage.
Fair enough. I mean, interestingly, you mentioned Iran, because as I understand it, Germany is the number one trade partner of Iran.
Yeah. Iran, I mean, also with Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, right? Germany was really, really important. It helped building up the Iraqi chemical weapons program, for example, that was used against the Kurds and also used against Israel. So, of course, I mean, this is all quite cynical.
It's kind of show how virtuous we are, but then make some money on the side.
Yeah, of course, there's...
Or the other way around.
A lot of hypocrisy involved, a lot of double standards involved, obviously. So it was, I think, German Middle East policy has been about balancing out economic interests with the Arab states and keeping good relations with Arab states, especially after the oil crisis in the 70s and so forth. And sort of like keeping the relationship with Israel stable, which was done a lot also in later stages through secret military relations and so on. But yeah, of course, it's a complicated game.
So you mentioned that Germany has been reducing how many weapons it's sending to Israel. Do you think this is a question of degree, or do you think there is actually a red line that Israel could cross that would go too far for the Federal Republic of Germany, and there would ever be a break, or are these two entities kind of combined, entangled forever?
I mean, Germany has formulated red lines, and one of them is the displacement of the Palestinian population in Gaza, for example, right? Which arguably has already happened. I mean, they are internally displaced and, sort of like set back and forth. The answer is that I simply don't know, because the German government also doesn't know, right? There was, after October 7th, this moment of truly unconditional solidarity, this bear hug approach that really mirrored the US approach. And I think there was an idea, maybe a fantasy, that this could be a very short war in Germany, but it's not.
It could have been, if that was what Netanyahu wanted, arguably, right?
Yeah, I mean, it could have gone very differently, potentially. And now Germany is stuck with the situation, and they don't want this situation, right? But they also don't know how to get out of it. Mm-hmm. And also, I think we shouldn't overestimate German sort of like influence in that regard. Germany will, in the end, especially in this war, follow the US approach. So if we want to find out what will be decided in Berlin, we have to look at Washington first.
Mm. And I want to come back to what you said about German domestic politics, about how you don't quite understand it. But I've seen you use this term, Ersatznationalismus, proxy nationalism.
Yeah.
Do you think that goes towards explaining why Germans take this stuff so personally? Why anything that's anti-Israel is considered to be the same as being anti-Semitic, which is very problematic. And people get very personally offended by criticisms of Israel, even when they're coming from, let's say, Palestinians who have lost family members. So why do they only have empathy for one side of this conflict? And is it because they actually see themselves in a weird way as Israelis?
Well, Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister, said this after October 7th. She said, "We are all Israelis."
Yikes.
Very clearly untrue, and potentially there was a wish behind that statement. I don't know. Haven't asked her.
Psychodrama.
It's part of that, right? And we've talked about the term Staatsräson and how Germany is the only country whose Staatsräson at another states. Staatsräson, right? And that already tells you about this identification and over-identification, right, with another state. So I think this is where this idea of proxy nationalism comes in. Because also, what do you want to build German nationalism on, right? It's quite difficult. So one way to build German nationalism is to be proud of how well you have mastered your past, right? There is that element in German memory culture. I do think that German memory culture after the late 70s, 80s, and the 90s did make some really important progressive steps. But there's also if you want, dialectic at work that turns this around and turns working through the crimes of this nation into the source for being proud of this nation, right? And this identification with Israel plays into that, and is also embodied by the term Staatsräson.
I think we've seen that a lot with this discussion about whether what's happening in Gaza is a genocide or not. I've seen commentators say, hey, I'm German, I know what a genocide is. And it's this almost humble bragging in a sense, like, hey, we're the worst, but we know it, so we're the best, right? It's a little bit perverse, actually.
Yeah.
And I've also seen, liberal commentators say, well, we supported them, so the Jews have forgiven us. And of course, that's not in all cases true, right? So there's a lot of wish fulfillment at play here, I think.
I'm not sure if anybody has forgiven anything. What Germany has done through this historical move of supporting Israel is to give Israel the power of absolution, right? But it's Germany that gave Israel that power, right? So Germany is expecting from Israel this absolution. But this can potentially quite quickly be turned around in a bad way if this institution is not being extended, right? So I think to this day, we still have this underlying dynamic, this underlying structure of German support for Israel in exchange for a questionable absolution for Germany.
And why is it always about Israel? I mean, this is a very state-focused approach to the problem, but actually the Nazis and their collaborators didn't kill a state. They killed citizens of many different states. So why is it everything, this absolution takes place on a state level? And how many of the reparations were actually given to individual survivors in comparison to the Israeli state?
I think there you have to differentiate between governmental reparations and a societal reckoning with the past. You know, you previously mentioned Stolpersteine, for example, right? Which is a, you know, it comes out of a social activism, right? But when a state does memory work, this work will be geared towards the power, the sovereignty of that state. So every step that Germany has taken in memorizing the past as a state has been linked in some way to German power, to German sovereignty, right? And I think this is really important to remember. This is also why one should not rely, I think, on the government, on the state to memorize, to remember its own crimes, right? I think this, at the end of the day, has to be a social effort. And I think this is also where the positive steps that we can observe were taken in Germany.
And what do you think would be a good way for Germany to come to terms with this on a state level? Is it possible?
I think that's a critical question that you can answer according to your own politics, right? At the end of the day, the term Staatsräson can mean many things. It could mean sending German planes to Tehran, right? It could also mean calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, right? You could fill it in many different ways, but that's a political choice.
Great. Daniel Marwecki, thank you very much.
Thank you, James.
Wow, that was really interesting. If you enjoyed it too, feel free to hit subscribe and share this on social media, or give it a high rating or a thumbs up wherever you listen to your podcasts. This is a completely independent podcast, so we need your support. Thanks very much.